Welcome to the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Davidson, and in this podcast, we'll explore the art and science of negotiation in real-world situations. Whether you're negotiating a business deal, asking for a raise, or trying to resolve a conflict with a colleague or loved one, negotiation is an essential skill that can help you achieve your goals and build better relationships. Through interviews with experts, real-life stories, and practical tips and techniques, we'll deep dive into the strategies and tactics that can make you a better negotiator. From understanding your own negotiation style, to reading body language, handling difficult conversations, and overcoming common challenges, this podcast will give you the tools you need to negotiate with confidence and achieve your objectives. So whether you're a seasoned negotiator looking to refine your skills, or someone who's new to the game, join us as we explore the world of negotiation in real life. Welcome back to this week's episode of Negotiation in Real Life. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Tristan Larkin, a passionate buyer's advocate renowned for his ability to uncover off-market properties in inner Melbourne and the southeast, making him a true specialist in the field of real estate. For Tristan, it's all about the joy of the hunt and the thrill of discovering hidden gems in the property markets of Melbourne. His genuine passion for the real estate industry led him to join forces with the highly regarded agent James Rankin, with whom he shares a common vision of delivering ethical and tailored results for his clients. Tristan, welcome to the show.
Nicole, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Excellent. And I'm looking forward to talking about some of the negotiations in the property space, because I think for a lot of people, it's a really important negotiation that they have, and probably one of the biggest that they'll have in their lives. So we're going to be exploring that a little bit and giving our listeners something to take and some tips that they can apply. Before we get into that, I'd love to have a little bit more idea about how did you get into this field, particularly as a buyer's agent in the property space?
Yeah, so interestingly, I started in the world of the sort of music and entertainment industry. I worked initially with artists and festivals, and I started off doing, I suppose, a bit of negotiation in that world too, like dealing with artist contracts, writers and bookings. That's a really interesting one from the negotiation side.
Fascinating. Yeah, I've been doing a bit of work this year with the Victorian Music Development Office. So actually working with a few music agents and helping them develop skills as well. So I did not know we had that connection.
Yeah, I remember when I first came into the industry learning a bit about what those negotiations would take part in terms of booking artists and stuff. They'll have 40 different clauses in their contracts of all of the demands of what they needed to do. And the artist writers are always really funny. There's renowned cases of some artists saying that they need to have only green M&Ms in their writers like before going on stage. And if, the booking agent didn't have only the green M&Ms, they'd think that, well, what else have you missed in the contract? And then they would try to walk in and out of the deals and stuff like that. So yeah, I've always noted that you need to pay attention to every sort of line when making offers. And yeah, so I started there actually. And then I always sort of wanted to work in the real estate space. I've loved property. Going in and out of homes was something that I always found really interesting. I've always been going through sort of open for inspections. And I came into the real estate space, like I actually went straight into buyer's agency, which is, it's becoming more common that people do that. Though I sort of saw my sister and, a few friends really struggling coming into the market. They'd been lied to pretty blatantly from agents and had really negative experiences. And I remember sort of seeing my sister and breaking down in tears when they've missed out on like the second or third property, thinking that they're never going to get in. And I really just resonated with the idea of trying to help people navigate into the industry. And it's the real journey of creating a brief and figuring out where the next stages of your life are going to be. So yeah, and because of that, I've absolutely loved it. Really enjoy the industry and think it's a beautiful chapter that we get to be a part of with families.
Yeah, I love that. Fantastic. And I think that idea about being driven in your career of choice through the desire to help people is really lovely too, because I think for me that's one of the things that drives me through my dispute resolution work as well. So clearly the real estate industry and your previous experience as a music agent both involve a lot of negotiation. Have you ever had any formal negotiation training?
So when I studied management at university, And we did must have been like a trimester on negotiation. The breadth of study that I did was like 12 weeks or something, or however long it was. And we read like Getting to Yes, and then did multiple sort of like role playing on negotiation then. But from a formal standpoint of like training, I feel like really doesn't benefit you until you're actually doing a bit of it in practice as well, so that when you can actually apply them.
Timing is everything, isn't it?
Yeah. You need to understand how some of the theory actually can sort of slot in a practical standpoint, I think, as well. So, I mean, I actually did do a very small amount, mind you. I've never done like any major courses. And then other than that, it's just been reading a couple of books here and there. And I've, done a lot of the Chris Voss stuff. I sort of got obsessed with him for a little while, thinking that, that was, I was fascinated by it, because I've always known that negotiating, it's going to completely determine, the future of where you're going down with like career paths and, monetary compensation and so many different avenues of life. But yeah, I'd love to actually know if, what other sort of training is there? Like, is there courses for it as well? Or
there certainly are. And there's not a lot of long, 12-week courses even. I mean, there are some university courses that run a semester long, but a lot of what most people do from a negotiation perspective is shorter term than that. So it is more executive education type programs. And, some of the programs that I run are, sometimes they're only one day. But what I find is that I'm working with people who are already experienced in negotiation like yourself. And what I'm doing when I'm training them is bringing them. I talk about the idea that most people are negotiating at a level of what we call unconscious competence. They're just sort of going on autopilot, negotiating without thinking about what are the different approaches that they could be taking and what are they actually doing. They're sort of almost just, floating on autopilot, if you like. And so when I bring people into a room for training, it's about taking them off that autopilot, bringing them back to what we call conscious competence, so that they're actually unpacking, well, what are the choices that I'm making along the way in this negotiation, and what are the alternative choices I could be making? And then I give them a strategy. So I give them a sort of a systematic understanding. So basically what you would have talked about from reading Getting to Yes, that a lot of people don't know or haven't heard of. Once you give them that sort of systematic understanding of what is the actual dynamics of what's going in a negotiation, then they can make more strategic choices throughout the negotiation process. So that's, what a lot of it is. And I think you're right. And I think that point about you can't actually learn it without doing it. It's a lifelong learning process, but you need to start with a bit of guidance and support. So there you go. You'll have to come along to one of my courses one day.
Yeah, I'd absolutely love to. That unconscious sort of negotiation like that, I think that makes a lot of sense, because I suppose some people would, it's like whatever their personality is, if they're really down the line, or some people are a bit more aggressive. I've experienced like with real estate agents as well, like, the big, strong people that are loud, they can just sort of try to overpower, and that's their sort of style. And some other people are all about, like, oh, let's try to work together on this.
But I think it's interesting too, because I think one of the things comes from what you expect negotiation to be. And for a lot of people, if you think about where you learn negotiation, you obviously learn it from those around you, your family, your employment colleagues, but we also learn it from what we see on TV.
Oh, yeah.
And negotiation in Hollywood drama is always that aggressive kind of style, because a nice collaborative negotiation conversation, pretty boring to watch. And so a lot of people, even if their natural style is to be collaborative and work together, sometimes when they get into a bigger negotiation, which obviously buying a house is really significant, they think they've got to be that Hollywood style, dramatic, aggressive negotiator. So when you tell them actually that's not the best way to negotiate, they're like sometimes quite relieved.
Yeah, they've watched Suits and they think that they need to be Harvey Specter having a yelling match, or offering to get into the boxing ring if it doesn't work out. Yeah, exactly. I feel like some agents have done that actually.
I suspect that's probably the case.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
So if you think back to some of the negotiations that you've been involved in, and it could be in the real estate or the sort of prior, are there any that you sort of stand out to you where you've had a major sort of aha moment, or you've learnt something and that's fed through to how you negotiate moving forward?
Yeah, I think for real estate, the most important thing is just having access to information. So understanding the reasons behind why the vendor is selling and what, their motivations are. Have they already purchased another property? Like we've discovered sometimes that it's, the vendors are getting divorced and there's a court mandated date that the property needs to be sold by. So all of those things are, is the absolute game changer. And sometimes it's like, well, we've been thinking about making an offer on a property and then we discover something about that, like, why the vendor's selling it. Well, it turns out they've already purchased and they need to sell this within a certain time period because they need to do a simultaneous settlement and you need to have the same settlement dates that work. So you get all of these like additional information and it's like, oh, wow, well, we either need to move really quickly or maybe we should wait, let the pressure build, see what everyone else does. And I think, when I initially just started, I thought negotiating on properties was more so about looking at comparable sales and trying to do valuations on the property itself. But I think it's actually more important to gather information on the vendor and their circumstances and, the agent and their relationship. And it's not on the back end.
Yeah, I love that. Well, that's it. And it comes back to, if you bring that back into negotiation strategy, it's about understanding the interests, that whole thing about why is the vendor selling, what are the timeframes that are important to them, but it's also about alternatives. What's it going to be for the vendor if this doesn't go through? And, knowing that they've got a court date. So not having a sale is going to have negative consequences. So if you come back to, in every negotiation, thinking about those interests and alternatives, it gives you a lot of scope in the negotiation. And, what you've talked about there is identifying those levers that you can use to get the best deal possible for your client.
Yeah, it's so important. And it's where deals will fall apart as well if you don't understand all that. The hardest negotiations that I ever go into is dealing with agents that are like, they're not the person directly speaking with the vendor. And so it's like you're doing third part and they don't know. Like they literally don't know a lot of the information, or if they're just not willing to communicate a lot of the information. Like some agents are really prideful that they never disclose anything about their vendors. And that is just so frustrating because you just have it feels like you're sort of just going into the negotiations blind.
Yeah. Which of course, if you were acting for the vendor, particularly if you were in one of those situations where it is a divorce or there's something going on that means that they need to sell, I'd be asking my agent not to disclose any of that because for exactly the reason you want to know it, I don't want you to know it.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I would be doing the exact same thing if I was on the sales side. Honestly, it's surprising how little that is the case though. Whereas most agents out there are so willing to give me absolutely any piece of information. And I found that this is one of the problems, I believe, with the real estate sales industry is that a lot of the top agents are simply too busy. Like if they've got 15 listings on and they can't even be at all of their open homes on a Saturday and they're just back to back. They're 30 minutes. They've got to get to the next one, pack up quick, 30 minutes, pack up quick. And they're just out all day. I found a lot of the times it's just like they're looking to get quick deals rather than following, what probably is best practice that was, would drag it out a little bit longer. Like whatever I ask, they just usually would give it to me fairly quickly, especially I think because I'm a buyer's agent as well. I think they're more willing to disclose information, which doesn't make any sense at all, but it's something that I've definitely experienced.
But it's interesting because I know when we were selling our previous home, one of the things that we were worried about is this idea that for an agent, getting a sale is a win. The difference between getting that last $10,000, for example, to the agent, it's next to nothing in terms of their commission, but it's a lot of money for the vendor. So there's that sort of mismatch of interest between the selling agent and their client, which is where we tried to resolve that by putting a clause in the compensation clause to say, this was our expectation, but anything that they got above a certain point, their commissions went significantly up to incentivize them enough to actually want to get that extra bit. But that, what you're saying there is really that example where for them, it's just a numbers game. Just get them banged out, sell them. What we sell them for is almost irrelevant to them. other than their reputation, I guess.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. I recommend doing those remuneration structures as well, like from a sales point, where it's. But in order to do that correctly, you need to have a fairly good understanding on what the market value is for comparable sales. So, say hypothetically, it's probably around 1.5, but if the agent like thinks, oh, hang on, this thing's actually worth 1.8, and then all of a sudden you incentivize them too high, it can be a little bit of a problem. But I think that is the structure to go with, because you're right. Like if they're just on a standard, I don't know, 1.5, 1.8% commission on a property, then it could be the difference between a couple of $100, whereas it could be, tens of thousands of dollars for the vendor. So that we see that a fair bit as well. It's just like, oh, come on, let's just sign something.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk about the role of emotion because, and I think this is really interesting, one of the challenges I think for people buying property is where they get emotionally attached to the property. And I can confess that when my husband and I bought our first home, we'd been looking for a little while at all these properties. And there was one property, the very first time I saw it online, not even in the flesh, I went, I've got to have that property. That is our new home. Now, of course, we also knew, and I've got a very, very sensible husband, but we knew that wasn't going to be our forever home. We were going to grow out of this home. So we needed to make sure that it was a commercial purchase because we probably weren't going to be in there long enough to make up for any overpayment. Now, interestingly, what we did was hire someone like yourself to come in and actually run the negotiations for us and keep that kind of commercial focus as the primary being. What's your experience of working with buyers and where does emotion get in the way in some of those negotiations?
It's people throw away money when they love a property. They're just throwing it out the window. And I see it all the time, because we used to work a lot with investors, and for them it's just numbers. Does it make sense? Is it the right yield? Hang on, what are the mortgage repayments? Can I afford that? And that's what it is. Like most times the investors didn't even inspect a property. It was just they'd look at it online and they'd look at a calculator, and if it makes sense, then you buy it. But if not, but we're currently working predominantly with owner occupiers, a lot of first home buyers, a lot of upgraders.
Yeah.
And they're people that are thinking, well, this is where we're going to raise the family. Can my dog run around in the backyard? Can I get a dog if I don't have one? And they purchase mostly with emotion. Now, we do suggest, depending on the circumstances, depending on the client, you do actually need to factor in a little bit of an emotional price because that is often what the other parties are going to be doing as well. But you do need to have a cap on that. You absolutely need to have a cap on that. And we suggest if you're going into a negotiation, I suggest set the walkaway number before it all begins. So before you make the first offer, before the agent tells you, that someone else has come in with a higher offer than you, and can you stretch? Can you all this? Set the walkaway number before all of that. Factor in a little bit of an emotional price because if your sister lives on the same street or your workplace is around the corner, like all those things matter, but you don't want them to matter to the stage where it's like, well, you're about $40,000 over what the next door neighbor sold their house for last week. So you're just throwing money away. But we've had clients in that situation freak out a little bit when we are not playing the game of the agent. Like just recently on a deal, we made an offer and I knew that we were pretty close to what, the value needed to be. It was an off-market deal. It was sort of no one else. And they were their threat to us was that, we're going to put it on the market. If you guys don't want this, we'll just put it on the market. And anyway, they came back to us. They countersigned an offer and it was like, maybe it was like $70,000 above what we made. And it was like a $1.2 million property. So it's a fair jump.
Yep.
And my clients were getting nervous because they had already planned their renovation out in their head and they loved the location and they were showing me pictures of bathrooms of what they were going to do to the place. And they'd taken their family through twice and their parents loved it. And so from like an agent, that's all the alarm bells ringing, like, this is it. Anyway, like I was just sort of saying to the client, hey, look, we're not going to sign that counter offer. Like this is where we're going to come in, substantially lower rather than giving them an extra $60,000. Let's offer them $6 million. That's where I think, value is like their situation. It makes sense. And And they were like, my clients were really worried about it. They're like, oh my, but if they don't accept it, can we just like go back and accept theirs afterwards? Like, does that mean their offer's not on the table? And I was like, just, like, we're just going to move forward here. Like, hold on, don't go call the agent or anything like that, which has happened once to me before. And we got the deal done. And then it was like, they were obviously overwhelmed. Yeah, the 6. Yeah, that was it. We didn't increase it anymore after that, even though they were trying to push it.
So you just saved your client $54,000 by them following your advice.
Yeah, and they couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe it because they really were just like, all that factored in their mind was, we cannot miss out on this. And that's like a pretty common headspace to be in once you've allowed yourself to like emotionally love a property. But that is where, like, on those last few calls and those last few, bits of back and forth, that's where you either make or lose a lot of money. So yeah, we were able to do that. And I think it was just because I sort of knew the agent, and I knew, like, from the conversations, I could feel that we were close, even though he wasn't alluding to it. And yeah, afterwards, the client couldn't believe it. They told everyone, and it gave us really great reviews, and that was great. But yeah, I remember I reflected on that after that sort of deal was done, and I was like, oh my God, like, it's so easy to throw away a lot of money, when you're at that pointy end, and you're taking big loans, and it's like the bank's money as well. So yeah, it's really important, but emotion plays a huge part.
Yeah, and it's not just the seven. I think it was 70. So you actually saved them 64,000, not 54. That's huge. But it's not just the 70,000 extra that they would have paid. It's the interest on that 70,000 and the compounding effect of all of that as well. So, there's a massive difference. I'm interested. So that really raises as well. I mean, one of the things that often comes up with properties is, where do you start? Where do you put the first bid in if you really want to secure the property? Do you have some strategies around that have worked for you?
Yeah, and I'd love your take on this as well, because we have gone down multiple different paths with, in different circumstances before, and sometimes it works and sometimes it just doesn't. And like, we have to sort of run the gauntlet on that. So again, it depends on the client and the circumstances and the property, but I would much rather start low, but I don't want to be insultingly low, because I think the most important thing in deals on property is speed. So if you make probably the biggest deal that we've ever done in terms of like negotiating price it was an obscure property, and it was a block of units, and it was an investor. So, and it was about 12 months ago to the date. We were coming into Christmas time. The auction was, I think, the week before Christmas, which I love doing deals then, because there's this emotional thing in the vendor's head that's like, I just need to get it done before Christmas. It's very common. You see it in buyers as well. They're like, I need to buy this year. Like, it needs to be done before Christmas. I think it's just like an emotional weight. You don't want to carry all of that into the new year. You want like a fresh page. So I love doing deals around this time because, there's just that additional pressure, like time pressure, that can work in your favor. So it was a property that was quoted, I think 2.2 to 2.35 off memory. And we made an offer 2 weeks before the auction for like 1.7. So like,
wow,
enormously below
massive difference,
what they were quoted. But we knew that they didn't have interest on the property, and we found a comparable sale that had plans and permits approved for an 8-unit development site on a similar size block in the same suburb like a month before. So we had some factual evidence that we could sort of use against them as well. We weren't just like making up a number. And we knew that the value was above the 1.7, but because we knew that there was no interest in the property, we wanted to start low just to sort of get them to start to change their mind. And like, I know that Chris Voss calls that anchoring, but I think anchoring can backfire like when you anchor low. So anyway, in this particular case, they like the week after they reduced the price to like 2.2 to 2.3. I think they reduced it by like 150 grand from the top end. I know 2.1 to 2.2, sorry. And then, on auction day, we ended up giving them an offer of like 1.8. and we were the only people there. So they just passed it into us. And then we had to negotiate back and forth.
Yeah.
And it was a really interesting one because the vendor was standing on one side of the road, we were standing on the other side, and the agent was just walking back and forth like consistently. And we just held our ground. We just said, we're not going to increase anymore. And then they sort of finally said 1.9, and we purchased it for 1.9, which was like, I think it was a ridiculous deal. The clients were really happy. They were investors and like the numbers worked there. And it was ended up being like 400 grand under what the top of their range was, which they said that they initially wanted at the start of the deal. So in that one particular case, the lowballing worked for us, though we've also had cases even recently where we make an offer 30 grand below the range. And then they just say, well, we're not going to accept that because we want this. And then someone else a week later comes in with the offer that they want. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, if we had have given them a strong offer immediately, we probably could have taken that off the market below what it ended up selling for.
Right. I mean, I think the strategy that you used in that first example really is almost textbook, because what you've done is you haven't just lowballed, you'd actually lowballed with an explanation for that, which takes the insult out of the low ball. Even though you might never have expected to get it close to that, the fact that you've actually backed it up with fairly objective data that can rationalise it is a good thing, because what the research tells us is if you're just negotiating on price, that's the only variable in here at the moment, you are going to end up at somewhere between the first offer and the first counter offer. And so what you want to do, and what you've done really well in that one, is you've come up with a justification for putting an offer, the first offer, at somewhere that's quite low. What that's going to necessarily do is they're not going to come back and say 2.35 at that. They're going to have to bring their counter offer down in response to getting that low offer. So you're setting that sort of midpoint that we know that the negotiation might end up at somewhere that's more favourable to your buyer. Now, when is that not going to work? Obviously, when there's more competition, because they've got better alternatives in the background. So to use that strategy, you've got to be pretty confident that it is just a one-dimensional negotiation between two parties. And as you've said, there's that challenge when there's more competition, that by putting in that low ball offer, and I don't know in that second example of whether you had a reason for the offer that you gave or if it was just a low ball, but when there's more competition, they're just as likely to go, these guys aren't serious, we'll deal with someone who is. Now, probably what you can do if you still want to try that low ball offer, you could signal to them that there's more to come. So you could go, look, this is our offer. At this stage, that's what the client instructions are to offer this. But if there's another offer, let me know, because I can probably get more out of them, is a way that rather than them just taking the next offer, you're still going to keep yourself in the running potentially.
Yeah. I found that as well, no one accepts the first offer no matter what it is.
Yeah.
So you need to start at a place that you do have a little bit of breathing room. And my clients have said this to me before. They're like, oh, well, I just want to offer a fair price, which it's a rare client, but I've had people say, hey, I just want to offer a fair price. Like, I don't want to start too low. I'm happy to go to this level. And then I said, I think we'll end on that level, but I just know regardless of where the offer comes in at, like most people just feel like, oh, well, I want to have felt like I got something out of a negotiation.
Totally.
It's like human nature, right?
Well, and in fact, if your client put that offer in and it was accepted, your client would feel a little disgruntled. And this is the problem, because they show that, if your first offer is accepted, most people walk away feeling unsatisfied from that negotiation. They call it the winner's curse.
Really? I've had real estate agents tell me as well, the worst thing that can happen in an auction campaign is getting a really strong offer in the first week, because the vendor will think, well, if there's one person out there willing to pay that, surely there's multiple and it'll be better for me if I take it to auction. And it's like, oh, well, maybe we should increase the quote then, because we've got so much interest that it's like, they're reluctant to accept something which could be the best offer that's only coming once because of some exceptional circumstances.
Well, that's quite interesting, because that was actually the story when my husband and I bought our first house. Really? Was we put a decent offer in the first week of the campaign. So we saw it at the first open, and within about 3 days after that, we put an offer in. Interestingly, we had a buyer's agent who was advising us, and I had put my name down when we did the open for inspection. So we put the offer in my husband's name, and they're like, we've never heard of this person. Who is this person putting an offer in? We assumed that they'd call me back and try and get a counter offer from me because I had expressed interest at the open, but they never did. But anyway, we'd put this offer in. It was pretty generous. And at auction, it passed into us. There were a couple of other bidders, but they walked out. So it passed into us at auction. And then what was interesting was that while our agent was in there negotiating, and we weren't even physically at the property at the time, somebody apparently knocked on the door and said, we want to put an offer in. And our buyer's agent said to the real estate agent, if you talk to them, I'm walking.
Wow. Yeah.
We'll just talk to you. Anyway, we ended up buying that property for $44,000 less than what we had offered them pre-auction.
There you go. There's the facts. It can backfire, can't it? Yeah.
But it can. And, the hard part is, and this is where it does become difficult, is you can't ever know whether it's going to be the case where it backfires or it doesn't, because it is all of those dynamics of the negotiation, particularly around the level of competition, that are going to determine if that works. And so, as you said at the very beginning of our conversation, the more information you have about what's going on, who's interested in the property, the more you've got sort of some ability to decide what that strategy will look like. And, it's the absence of that information that makes those negotiations challenging often.
Yeah. Yeah. It in the end, I think it's always just going to come back to information. And just knowing the right questions to ask, which is where I think buyer's agents can be really beneficial, just because they know what to ask. And as another example of time that it was a game-changing piece of information, we discovered that we're essentially, expressed interest in a property. We were told that there was another offer at X level, and that in order to be able to get a deal done, we needed to come in at Y. We needed to be above that by this amount, and that was what the vendor wanted, and it's what the agent said is where we would need to be in order to get it done. And so I was like, okay, well, can you just tell me a little bit more about this other offer? What are their terms? And they're like, oh, they don't have finance. It's a really strong offer. They haven't done building and pests. They're a developer. And I was like, oh, okay, they're a developer. And I was like, well, the only thing that they didn't tell me, I was like, well, what are their settlement terms then? And they're like, oh, they've said it's going to be, they need a 6-month settlement because they wanted to go to council, And I was like, oh, if it's a 6-month settlement, and I knew that this particular vendor needed to settle quickly. Like they asked us if we could do 60 days or 30 days or something. And I was like, well, you've told me that you've got this really strong offer, but it's not strong at all. Like you couldn't accept it even if you wanted to. So it doesn't matter what the price is. And I just feel like, someone else that, especially first home buyers, it's their first time doing it.
Yeah.
And if maybe the only help that they've got is from mum and dad that bought a home 20 years ago or something, So and if they just didn't ask that one question of what's that final piece of information that you didn't tell me, then they could have been paying way overs for something that, that you wouldn't have ever needed to in the first place, just because you didn't understand. Agents are really good at, so a lot of them won't blatantly lie to you, but they're very good at telling you only the information that makes something look good.
Yeah, that's it. It's that sort of deception by omission, isn't it? And as you said, the agents know that you know it. So when you ask the question, they know they're going to have to give you an answer. But when somebody else who isn't experienced in property asks that question, they could just turn around and say, "Oh, we're not allowed to tell you that information," or "It's not relevant," or something. So that's where having someone who knows the rules of engagement really adds value. We've talked about some, really interesting things, but there are, generally obviously some challenges that come up in negotiations from time to time. What are the things that you find the most challenging when you're dealing with some of these property negotiations?
Yeah, the biggest one's dealing with egos, I think, from agents. And I've had some experiences where the clients really want something and the agents, just want to do it all their way, and they don't want to even negotiate. They want to do it how they've sort of told their vendor, and they don't want to look silly sort of thing, or whatever it is. And we've had multiple experiences. One particular comes to mind where a property was severely underquoted, And it was in a first home buyer market as well. And it was probably like, I think we had a budget of 650 and I think it was quoted 5 to 550 going for an auction campaign. And we knew that there was no chance that it was going to sell even remotely near the top of the range. So, and my client's like, well, I want to make an offer before the auction then. And I sort of told the agent and he's like, no, we're not accepting offers prior. And I was like, oh, okay. Is that, specifically what your vendor has instructed you? And he's like, oh, I'm not going to tell you that because there is like a tick box on their authority that says specifically like, do not provide us offers prior and if it's above this level. And he was sort of refusing to do anything. And then he said he's going to stop answering calls for me. He didn't want to speak to me anymore. I was like, I've got an interested buyer. And anyway, the client was like, well, I want to make an offer. So make the offer. And I was like, okay, follow the client's instructions. Like it makes a lot of sense that, they're criminally underquoting this property. So we were like $40,000 above the top end of the range.
Yeah.
And then finally gives me a call. Agent's just like screaming his head off, said he's deleted the email, didn't exist, didn't happen. And I was shocked. I was like, I can't believe that, this is sort of happening, and just forwarded that correspondence on to the directors of the agency. Then he called me and he's like, hey, I think we got off to the wrong foot. maybe we should have another chat about this. And like legally they needed to change the quoted range on the property because, an offer's come in that's been rejected prior to the auction. They didn't do that. So they're just like blatantly not following the laws at all. And they're the more challenging experiences. We ended up missing out on that property, which I was really annoyed about, by like $1,000 at auction. But the agent was, it was an absolute ego play. He was saying, we've had 19 people register for the auction. It's like, well, it's not something to brag about. Clearly it's not showing how good you are. It's showing how underquoted the property is. And all of the people that were there because of the price range were first home buyers that didn't know any better. So there was only 2 people that made bids in the end. It was us and one other party. So out of 19 people that said that they were going to bid when they were there, like it never had a chance. So it's just, dealing with the people that are not willing to actually participate in negotiation is the hardest thing, I think, that I've found. But I'd love to know what your experience is like of dealing with egos, and because I imagine like emotion and egos would be like a massive part of your world.
Ego's massive, and there's a couple of things. So I guess coming back to your example and trying to unpack what was there, I mean, once again, he was unlikely, presumably, to share why he wasn't taking offers, and you don't know what's gone on in the background. So I'd be sort of starting to try and think in my head what could be in it for him to keep this offer away from the vendors. What possible reasons could there be? And one of the things that you're sometimes doing, particularly if changing what they've previously said is going to embarrass them or they're going to lose face, then you want to do what William Ury calls build them a golden bridge. So how can you help them reframe that situation to their client in a way that makes them look good? So, and I don't know if that was relevant in that particular instance or not, but that would be one thing, is sometimes they're getting so upset because they're going to look bad to someone else. So if you can help that person to look good to their stakeholder, that can help. The other thing is sometimes you want to get them out of the game. And, you talked about in that example, you actually wrote to the directors. So when you can bring extra people into the negotiation in one way or another to change the players, that's a really good strategy. Interestingly, in that particular scenario, you also had, particularly where he's breaching terms of the regulations for real estate agents, there is the ability to tell him that you're contemplating professional action against him if he doesn't do what he's required to do under the legislation, i.e. we need to have this offer put to your client and we need to receive a response from them. The other thing that sprung to my mind in that would be having had your client drop a letter into the letterbox of the property, if it was an owner-occupier at the time, to say, we've put this offer and the agent won't accept, won't actually take on board our offer. We don't know if he's conveyed it to you. We wanted to let you know that the offer had been made. So sometimes, even going around, once again, changing the players. Yeah, that idea about understanding why they're being like they are. And some people just not great people. That's the reality of the matter, is some people just are never going to be decent people. And So I think it's trying to figure out, is there a reason that they're being the way they are, and what's the consequences for them if they change their behaviour, or is it just that they're fundamentally a bad person, in which case whatever I can do to try and move around them and bring others in is going to be helpful to me.
I love that analogy of build them the golden bridge. I think that's a great way of explaining it, to sort of give them an out and make them look like the hero in the situation.
Help them save face, yeah. So it's like, an example of that would be, the person who's come in and said, no, there's absolutely no way on earth that I'm going to put an offer to my vendor. My vendor said, I don't know, I'm trying to make things up as I go. But then you would say, something, you'd keep talking and then you go, look, on the basis of what you said earlier, I understand you didn't want to pass this offer on, but we've now got more information on the table. And, if they understand this and that, then they might be quite willing to see what this offer is. So you're actually just you're almost like helping them frame that conversation so that they can take it back to their stakeholder.
One thing that I know is happening a lot in the world of real estate, especially this year, because listings were so low, a lot of agents were overquoting properties to their vendors just to be able to win business, saying that I can get you a higher number than what the other agent said.
Yeah.
And then what happens is they have to negotiate, they have to condition the vendor down to be able to change the price quote down, but they've already got their name on the exclusive authority, so it doesn't really matter the relationship then, because they've already won the business, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking, like in instances like that, where like we've seen it a lot, like in our like dealings and negotiations, where things are actually overpriced rather than underquoted, which is the typical thing that we see. And what I thought of in a situation like that is you could say, like, maybe provide with an offer, hey, we would have paid more, a few months ago, but since these current interest rates have, these interest rates have just taken out our borrowing capacity. The borrowing capacity has dropped by $60,000. So this is the best that we're able to do this month.
Yeah.
Like that would be a way that they can say, hey, it was actually worth this. What I initially quoted to you was correct, but the RBA's come out and made these decisions out of my hand. They agree. This is what we have now. Something like that. Maybe make them look like a professional or.
Yeah. It's trying to preserve that relationship that they've got, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And what about in your experience when you've dealt with someone they just don't want to play ball? Someone that's maybe they don't want to sell the business or like whatever it is because it's like got a lot of emotional value or, it's a reputation thing. And like, any other strategies that you've used that can really help like sort of get you on their side? So it's you and them versus the problem rather than just you versus them?
Yeah, look, one of the things, and once again, I'm not sure if it's the idea that you've got in your head, but I guess when you see things where there are almost forced sales, the couple that have to sell because they're getting divorced, or somebody who has bad health and has to sell the business but doesn't really want to. And so they can be quite, in those situations, because of the emotional attachment to this asset that they're selling, their perception of price might be well above market. So they're kind of pushing against the sale because they want an unrealistic price. And I think it's once again, if you can understand what their alternatives are, what does it look like for them if they're not going to sell this, and help bring them to a place where they realize that even though they don't like this offer that's in front of them, it's better for them than the alternative, and do that in a way that's gentle. So, I talk about a little complex to understand, but this is basically what I do in most of my mediations, is I tell people we're looking for the least worst outcome. You're not going to like any of the outcomes, but we're looking for the least worst. But I actually ask them questions that get them to see for themselves how bad it's going to look if they don't accept the offer, rather than try and sell that idea to them by telling them. So if I can just say, well, okay, I get that you don't want to sell it at this price, and I get that it's hard for you. So what's it going to look like? If we can't do the sale, what does that mean for you? How's that going to impact on you? What will be the next steps? All of those questions. And I don't even need them to answer those questions for me, because all I want to do is generate that thinking in their head. so that they get to a place for themselves where they go, oh, God damn it, I'm going to have to sell it. And this price is actually better than what I'm going to get elsewhere.
Wow. Yeah. I've heard one real estate agent do that. It was when we were assisting on the sales side of things. And he was like, he's one of the top agents and he deals with a lot of the high net wealth clients as well. So he sort of specializes in over $4 million properties. And I was sitting it was like a pre-auction meeting essentially. And he said to the vendors, I thought this was brilliant, like in a strange way, but it was brilliant. He said, I want you to, have a think tonight. You don't need to do anything today, but I just want you to have a think about and come back to me, on the auction day with 3 different prices. The first price is, you sell it immediately and we're all popping bottles of champagne together and it's a great deal. The next price is the price that you're going to hate me as an agent, definitely haven't got you the result that you want. It's not where it needs to be, but it's sort of what's come on the day and slightly disappointed in everything that's happened, but it's where things are. And he's like, the third price is the price that, you never imagined that you probably would have sold the property for, but based on how much it costs to hold all of these things, it's going to be better for you to sell at that price than having to deal with all of the expenses and all of the emotional drama and pressure and everything else that sort of comes with the property, to hold it. So that's the third price that I want you to come back to me with. And I was just framing it in that way where it's 3 different sort of set in stone values. Here's where we're drawing the line in the sand of the absolute walk away. Cause he's actually just asking them to give them the lowest reserve possible. But he's getting them to do it in a way where they're framing it as, this is the absolute minimum that would make sense. And I thought that was a really clever thing to do. And it sounds like that's exactly what you do as well.
But I love the way that he's done that too, and that what he's actually doing is he's preserving their sense of autonomy, that they've still got a degree of control. Because when you go straight to the super negative, people are feeling a bit like they're no longer in control anymore. They're feeling like this is being done to them rather than they are involved in that process. And so I think what he's done there is really clever.
Yeah, I remember thinking that and I was like, yeah, this guy's a pro. He's been in the game for a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, he had a really good specialization in just dealing with people and giving them a lot of time as well, which is why I think he made such success in that really high-end market, because he was just willing to dedicate a lot of time to all of the little conversations in between and really getting to know someone and why the property might be good for them or not. And and I think that's really important, I suppose, in all sort of elements of negotiating as well. It's really want to understand who the person is that you're sort of going against, because you're really not going against them.
No, that's it. And if you can actually, fundamentally in property sales, the buyer and seller have vastly different interests in monetary terms. But there are, if you can look for those other things, you're going to have a much better negotiation. And, the beauty of property is that there are some fairly objective values, although there's a bit of flex in those. But there is some guidance as to where this deal should be done. And it's just about who gets closer to one end of the gap.
I think the best deals that I've always done have always been where we want to get the best price and they want to get the best terms. And so it's we'll give you all of the terms, take them all. Because I often work with first home buyers, and I've noticed in looking back on all of the deals that have gone really, really well, it's where we're purchasing off someone that's a bit older. Maybe it's either a deceased estate or someone going to a nursing home or someone that's a downsizer. And they're typically not looking for squeezing pennies. They're more so about I want to have the long settlement so that I can, move easily, or I want to be able to do a license agreement and rent the property back just in case, because they're scared of being homeless. And it's totally, we'll give you all of the terms in the world. We'll do all the work. We'll do all the renovations. You don't need to get the property ready for sale. We'll give you everything that you need, but we want this price. And usually they're happy with that because, the extra $50,000 or $100,000 doesn't really change the world for them, but removing months of stress does.
Yeah, well, that reminds me, because I remember our neighbours sold a few years back, and I remember being really frustrated because I thought they sold at too low a price. And for me, that was a concern because obviously what they sold for impacted the value of my home. But it was interesting because when I talked to them about it, they said, you know what? We've owned this house for 30 years. It has more than paid us back. They really did not care. They'd bought it for something like, I can't even remember. It was, I think, in six figures, and they sold it for nearly 3 million. So they're like, you know what? We've made an absolute fortune out of this house. It doesn't matter to us whether we get, over 3 or not. So, well, once again, knowing the party and what they care about is important. I could talk to you about this for a very long time, but I think our listeners probably have other things they need to be doing today, Tristan.
Absolutely.
Before we wrap up, I've got one more question for you, which is particularly for anyone who's listening to this podcast who is in the market for property and may not have the means or the ability to bring a buyer's advocate in to assist them, which I think is a really good idea to have someone if you can. What's your number one tip to get a good deal on purchasing a property?
If there's one thing and only one thing, you need to know why the vendor is selling. That is the most essential piece of information. Because if it's, a deceased estate, if it's a divorce, if it's mortgagee sale and it's debt, if they've already purchased a property, what's their settlement date? Figuring out why they're selling is just the most important piece of information. Because there's some people out there that have got their properties listed for sale that actually don't really need to sell, and they're the worst. They're the worst you don't want to come across. But if there's one question that you should repeatedly ask the agent if they walk around it a few times and just frame it slightly differently and be really polite and just curious about it, it's just what was the reason for them selling? That's it.
I love that. And I think I'd add to that for people is don't feel like you haven't got a right to ask. Don't feel like you're being nosy. All they can say is no, I'm not telling you. Love it. Tristan, if people wanted to get in touch with you and have a chat about getting some advice on the purchase of their next home or anything else property related, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Yep. So you can book in a call directly with myself at www.tommy.com.au, and Tommy spelled Tomii. And we can have a chat, always down to have a chat with anyone just to sort of see where they're up to on their journey, whether they're going to auction tomorrow or they're planning and buying in 6 months. It's always good to just get an understanding of where people are at. Fantastic.
And I know this podcast goes out globally. You're probably not going to help people in Lithuania. I did have a Lithuanian listener last week. What is the area that you are able to help people in?
So, I mean, if you want tips on negotiation, I'm happy to sort of do Victoria-wide because I know the legislation, though we specialise in the inner Melbourne markets, and we've also got a gentleman that operates in Geelong.
Fantastic. Tristan, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope our listeners have found it really useful and taken some tips, but thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nicole. It's been a pleasure.
That's all for this episode of the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and learned something new that you can apply in your own negotiations. Remember, negotiation is a skill that can be developed and refined over time, so keep practicing and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us on social media or email us directly. And if you liked this episode, please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It helps us to reach more people and continue to produce high-quality content. Until next time, keep negotiating in real life.